Fabian Hurzeler is younger than 7 of his players, and he doesn't give a flying fuck. So, in this video, we're going to look at Brighton's new fearless tactics, learn about the manager's psychology to winning respect, and how this all came together in under 20 minutes of football. Fabian Hurzeler doesn't care about his age, he doesn't care about the top 6, and he certainly doesn't care what you think. And in fact, he's ready to disrupt the entire Premier League. Don't believe me? Well, let's look at how Brighton set up at the Emirates to prove Hurzeler doesn't care. I've set the board up with Arsenal in possession in this 3-2-5 shape, but it was how Brighton countered this which proved they had zero fear. Specifically with these 4 players here. The 2 central strikers had a job of staying close together and stopping any sort of progression through the centre of the park into this dangerous double pivot. And then the wide players in Minter and Matoma had a job of cutting this pass out from going down the line and jumping to these centre backs again to stop that progression from the back 3. And then with Odegaard's positioning further down the field, almost bringing Belieber into the back 5 here, and then Rice operating in this left-hand half space, it meant that if Brighton didn't win the ball up high up the pitch, which is one of their principles, it meant they were in a lot of danger in the centre of the park. Big gaps started to open up. But what impressed me most was the confidence and the belief in their approach higher up the pitch. Now, this approach wasn't without its flaws, and a big problem that's going to become a theme throughout this video is Brighton's staticness in their approach. When a player like Partey sees that he's not getting on the ball enough in the centre of the park, he dropped into this back line, allowing them to spread and create this width deep in their own half, which then circumvented this narrow press of Brighton, and they were able to get the ball to players like Saka in wide areas. And due to, again, Odegaard's positioning, taking that attention away from Belieber, Saka had this 1v1 versus the fullback. Now, I don't think this exposes holes in the entire idea. I think it just shows a lack of repetitions from the players in adapting within Hurzeler's principles to different changes of shape. But what it does show me is that Brighton's first idea, their first movement, is to be aggressive and on the front foot, which is incredibly impressive from a manager with that perceived lack of experience coaching at the Emirates. And then when we look at Brighton in possession, that bravery that we saw doesn't disappear. Fabian Hurzeler set Brighton up at the Emirates in a 2-3-2-3 structure, showing he doesn't care who his team is playing. The reason this structure is so impressive is because it has elements of elite teams. Firstly, we can see the 4 levels built through the pitch. This helps Brighton secure the ball as it progresses up the pitch, with lots of players able to combine both vertically and horizontally, and creates lots of different angles that if they were to build up in more of this shape, suddenly the team seems far more disconnected with holes starting to appear. Having multiple layers built through the pitch with the correct number of players in each plane is a numbers game that elite managers are constantly thinking about, and Brighton seem incredibly well coached in this area. And to the best of their ability, these positions on the pitch get the most out of the players as well, with 2 ball-playing centre-backs that can progress the ball through the lines, 2 full-backs that can play in these half spaces deep into the pitch, especially Hinchelwood, who can basically play as a double pivot. It allows for these wingers that are incredibly direct to isolate their fullbacks, stay wide and drive into the box. A good target man in Rutter or Welbeck, and James Milner, playing between the lines. We can't have it all. The fundamentals that Brighton showed at the Emirates show that they're willing to be brave and play their football no matter who they're facing. But how does a manager so young gain the respect of the players? Well, it's those football fundamentals which are winning over the talent pool at Brighton. Fabian Hurzeler has become a friendly authority at the Brighton training ground that is operating off one principle: intensity.
I call myself the friendly authority. I try to convince the players by using the power of the ideas.
Fabian Hurzeler doesn't care about the old school approach. He's not going to be an authoritarian type figure. That wouldn't work. He's not old enough and he doesn't have that type of experience. But what he does have is his knowledge.
A mixture between ball possession and intensity against the ball. And I think you need to have plans for both phases.
So he's looking to use that to help each player make the correct decision within his high-speed, intense football, meaning those lack of repetitions that we saw as a weakness before might just be a sign of Brighton growing, and they might just grow into something very dangerous.
And the players needs to feel what we can achieve. I want to achieve big things and I want to challenge the establishment.
And when it all clicks, it will be very scary. And it did just that versus Tottenham in under 20 minutes. But not before it went a bit wrong. This is how the game looked like as Spurs went 2-0 up versus Brighton. And again, we can see this narrow first line of pressure from Brighton, trying to stop the ball being progressed centrally. And what they expected was Tottenham's fullbacks to be tucked in the midfield, creating this star that we speak about so often with Tottenham, so the wider players in Minter and Matoma could sit and stop those passing lanes to the fullbacks. But that's not what Spurs did. And again, the changing of the opposition's shape caused Brighton to freeze. Rather than the fullbacks being tucked in the midfield, they dropped into the first line, creating this back four. And one of the two eights, depending on what side of the pitch, would drop into that vacant positioning, and one of the double sixes just froze, didn't follow him, meaning these wide players in Minter and Matoma had a problem. Did they follow their fullback into the wide area, leaving the eight free in the centre of the park ready to drive, or did they stay in that position, stop the ball being played into the eight, and allow for Tottenham to circumvent the narrow Brighton press and get the ball into dangerous wide areas? Even weirdly at times, Igor, the centre-back, followed that eight all the way into the centre of the park, and suddenly Brighton had a 3v4 at the back, and that's how one of the goals was scored. So Brighton were 2-0 down, and all video we've been saying that they freeze when the opposition's shape changes. But like I said, that lack of repetitions to adapt within Hurzeler's principles isn't a weakness. It's a sign of them growing, and when it clicks, it will be dangerous. And it did in the second half versus Tottenham. Brighton changed to this shape and stopped Tottenham entirely. Now, the central strikers were far more aggressive on the centre-backs, forcing them to play the ball. Hinchelwood, who before was in a double pivot with Belieber, has now pushed up onto Bentancur, again rushing this single pivot. They forced the ball to be played quickly by the ball players of Tottenham, but it was the positioning of the three players behind them which was so important. Through standing in the gaps between the fullbacks and the eights, it allowed them to have easier decision making as to who they jump and press, whilst maintaining the intensity of the press with these three players here. If the ball had played to the fullback, they could pin that fullback out wide. Or if the ball had been played to an eight, they could trap that eight in the centre of the park and win the turnover. This change of shape helped Brighton maintain that intensity that their principles demand, whilst also giving their players easier decisions to make with incredible width in their press, and they went on to win the game 3-2. And it shows that Fabian Hurzeler has the answers to Europe's most elite managers, and the lack of repetitions that his team have in adapting to changes of shape may not be a weakness for much longer, but a sign that his team are growing, much like him, because he isn't old enough. He might not be experienced enough, but he doesn't care because he's brave enough to play his football. And when it clicks, Brighton might disrupt the entire league.